Hello and welcome to the Medicine Box. Every year as winter settles over India's major cities, something else settles with it. A thick toxic blanket of pollution, the kind you can see, smell and unfortunately feel with every breath you take. In Delhi, winter air routinely falls into the very poor to severe categories, often between 300 to 500 plus, nearly 60 to 90 times higher than the WHO safe limit. Mumbai historically has been spared, is now seeing regular spikes between 100 and 150 and even higher on still humid days. To put this into perspective, some of the world's cleanest cities from Oslo to Vancouver often record pollution levels of under 10 to 15, and even in big busy coastal cities similar to Mumbai, the average pollution level is often below 10, sometimes as low as 3 to 5. The consequences are being felt in real time. Doctors, especially in the north, have been reporting a sharp rise in asthma, wheezing, bronchitis, cardiac events and winter strokes. And long-term exposure is now linked to diabetes, dementia, pregnancy complications and even a 2 to 3 year reduction in life expectancy in highly polluted regions. Doctors are no longer calling air pollution a respiratory problem. They call it a multi-organ toxin. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of us cannot simply pack up and move to cleaner air. Our jobs, our families, friends, our entire lives are here. So today, we are not just breaking down the science behind the smog, we are in fact answering a lot of questions which we need answers to when it comes to dealing with pollution in the cities of India. We have with us Dr. Vivek Nangia as well as Dr. Lancelot Pinto to answer a lot of these questions. Dr. Nangia and Dr. Pinto, welcome to the show. Dr. Pinto, I'm going to start with you. Just give us a sense in terms of the impact of pollution.
Thank you for inviting me on the show, Ekta. So pollution affects people in different ways. So there are those who have normal, healthy lungs, and then there are those who have chronic respiratory illnesses. So a lot of our patients who have chronic respiratory illnesses really struggle during this time. So people who've been reasonably stable on their inhalers, on their regular medication, suddenly start noticing a spike in symptoms. So there's more breathlessness, there's more wheezing, there's difficulty falling asleep at night because you're literally choking at night. And a lot of these people end up being in hospitals, getting hospitalized, having to receive short courses of steroids, antibiotics in this situation. Then there are those who really don't have any respiratory illnesses, but at the end of the day, it's the dose that determines the poison. When you take the air quality to such poor levels, even if you have the healthiest lungs, your lungs are going to kind of revolt. They're not going to be happy about the fact that they're being subjected to such high levels of pollution. And as a result, to protect itself, the lung, you end up coughing, you end up sneezing, you end up having watery eyes throughout the day. And on the whole, it's a pretty difficult time to be outdoors, especially if you're not protected in any way.
Okay. Well, Dr. Vivek, I just wanted to actually narrow down on what are the immediate effects that you're seeing in patients when the PM 2.5, which is basically the pollutants in the air, starts spiking.
So basically, as far as immediate effects are concerned, they would start with something as simple as watering from the eyes, headache, cold, cough, foreign body sensation in the throat or a sore throat, then migrating into lungs, causing chest tightness, wheezing inside. These are the simple and the straightforward effects. But also, apart from that, what we experience when there is an acute rise in the PM 2.5 particles, people who have an underlying asthma, who have underlying COPD or a heart disease, they all tend to flare up. As a result, we start getting admissions, more number of patients getting hospitalized with acute asthma episodes, acute COPD, and acute heart failure or heart attacks as well. Apart from that, now it is also being linked with uncontrolled blood sugars. If there's an acute rise in air pollution levels, that is also being seen to result in a poorer control of blood sugars and also inflammatory conditions like rheumatoid arthritis. So these are the conditions that you look at when you look at the acute effects. These are still manageable, but what are not manageable are the long-term effects. What we need to understand is that once asthma or COPD has set in because of the air pollution, then it's like a long-term management that goes on. Invariably, these patients develop incessant coughs, incessant breathlessness, and they're having to be given high doses of steroids, antibiotics for prolonged periods. So short-term and long-term effects are even worse.
Okay. Well, short-term and long-term effects are even worse. But Dr. Pinto, I wanted to ask you that many people are now exposed to toxic air every winter, but it's for a few months. So what is the long-term impact of this seasonal exposure?
Right, so if you look at the Lancet report in 2024, it's hypothesized that we lose almost 1.5 million people to pollution in the long run. And this is the cumulative effect. This is, if you take a disease like COVID, for example, we don't think it killed 1.5 people in a year. And yet all the alarm bells were ringing. We imposed lockdowns. We decided that the economic trade-offs were worth it simply because we were saving so many lives. The thing with air pollution is that, as you rightly pointed out, it's a cumulative effect. It's something that happens over the course of a lifetime. And we now realize that PM 2.5, these tiny particles spill over into the bloodstream and cause inflammation from head to toe. So it's no longer limited to the lungs. Pregnant women, for example, who are exposed to high levels of PM 2.5 deliver babies who are smaller, who have smaller lungs. People over the course of a lifetime, when they're exposed to these particulate matter, develop high blood pressure, inflammatory conditions like cardiac conditions, and is being linked with metabolic disorders like diabetes as well. So it's very difficult to do cause and effect because we expect just the lungs to be affected, but these cumulative effects over the course of a lifetime clearly take a huge toll, which is underappreciated.
Okay, so we shouldn't just assume that it's just 2 to 3 months of the year and hence there's not going to be much of an impact. That's not the way to look at it.
Of course not, because just those 2 to 3 months of exposure as well can make you end up in a hospital, for example, can cause you to have a heart attack, can cause you to have acute events during those 2 to 3 months. And then, of course, with every exposure, every winter, your lungs are potentially getting weaker, your arteries are getting, kind of more stiff over the years, and that will take a toll in the long run.
Okay. Well, Dr. Vivek, what is the most common type of respiratory issue that you're probably dealing with right now due to the high levels of pollution?
So I guess the most common issue that people come to us these days is with cough, phlegm, chest tightness. Patients who have an asthma underlying, they're experiencing a worsening in their condition. So are also those with COPD, those with interstitial lung diseases, headaches, persistent headache, which is relentless and doesn't go so easily. So these are the most common things. But the complications are far and wide. It could start from a lung cancer to a hypersensitivity pneumonitis to dementia now being associated with the long-term consequences and overall reduction in our lifespans. There's a study which has actually shown that overall in our country, because of the poor air quality, the life expectancy has gone down by about 5 years for all of us across the country. And in Delhi NCR per se, by about 11.9 years. So we've always known that WHO has also labeled air pollution as the single most hazardous environmental risk factor to our health. And now there's a study which has confirmed that further, which is published in 2024, which has shown that after hypertension, this is the largest risk factor to our health. And amongst children, after malnutrition, this is the largest risk factor to our health. So the effect of air pollution is far and wide.
Okay, well, you have named blood sugar, life expectancy as a whole, dementia, as well as cancer. So these are all very scary diseases to discuss and to talk about. And I'm just going to get to cancer in just a bit. But before that, I wanted to ask you, Dr. Pinto, that, COPD is now one of the second leading cause of death in India. And that's so surprising considering that nobody talks about COPD as much. It's not discussed. So what exactly is pollution doing when it comes to COPD? Are healthy individuals now also getting diagnosed with COPD?
Right, so COPD stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It's a disease in which the tubes of your lung kind of constrict. You're not able to breathe freely. It also destroys the tissues of the lung. Now, all over the world, COPD has been associated with the smoking of tobacco. But what we've often noticed in India is that a significant proportion of our patients who have COPD have never smoked in their life. So they're either exposed to biomass fuels like indoor cooking fuels, which leads to a huge exposure and therefore causing them to have COPD. But there is a subset of individuals who are not exposed to biomass fuels, not exposed to cigarettes, and yet seem to develop COPD. And there is no reason to believe that this quantum of air pollution that is constantly bombarding the lungs isn't the risk factor that's leading to COPD. It's the second leading cause of death in India. A huge number of patients are affected with COPD. In our own institute, when we looked at consecutive spirometries or lung function tests among healthy individuals undergoing a health checkup, we found that as high as 10 to 12% of people have abnormal lung functions. So again, I think these exposures are not directly linked because it's easy to see someone smoking and say that your lung issues are because of the smoking. But these exposures in the background definitely take their toll. And I don't think it's a coincidence that India has such a huge burden of COPD.
Okay. Well, Dr. Vivek, we were just looking at some statistics that 25 to 40% of lung cancer cases in India are actually of non-smokers. So how much of that would you probably attribute to pollution?
So, just as COPD, Dr. Pinto said that COPD was always considered to be a smoker's lung disease. Lung cancer is also always known to be a smoker's lung cancer. Now, unfortunately, we are seeing it amongst the non-smokers as well, especially in young women in their mid-20s and mid-30s. It is becoming very common. Of course, a lot of it is due to exposure to the biomass exposure, the chula smoking and all of that. But there's a large portion which would be being contributed because of the air pollution. One wouldn't know the exact figures, but yes, we believe that there's a strong link between the rising number of lung cancer cases amongst the non-smokers with the air pollution.
Okay, all right, fair enough. The other thing which was, spoken about is the incremental rise in strokes during this period of time, where the PMI is actually at these high levels in cities such as Mumbai and Delhi. You see a spike in terms of strokes amongst especially elderly patients. Well, Dr. Pinto, would you like to come in on that? What is the correlation between the two?
So it's fascinating how a lot of respiratory viral infections, for example, are followed by a high incidence of strokes. So we now realize that the spillover from the lungs into the bloodstream is very real. So if you have a COPD exacerbation or a lung attack, as we call it, and you're admitted for the same, the probability of you having a stroke in the next 6 weeks is extremely high. So this is what we call the spillover hypothesis.
This is only for serious respiratory diseases when you're admitted into the hospital.
Right. So following a viral infection of any kind, right, the incidence of what we call cardiovascular diseases rises. So whether it's a heart attack or a stroke, we've seen very often it is preceded by a respiratory event. So you have a viral respiratory infection, or you're exposed to pollution, or you have some sort of a pneumonia, for example, and your incidence of a heart attack and a stroke goes significantly higher. So therefore, it honestly comes as no surprise to us that when the air quality is really poor, that spillover from the lungs into the rest of the body causes your blood pressure to rise, causes an inflammation in your blood vessels, which is what strokes are all about.
Okay. Well, Dr. Vivek, would you like to come in on this? It's not only strokes, but even cardiac events seem to be correlated with higher levels of pollution.
So basically what happens is when you have a particulate matter 2.5 and smaller, that has a direct access into the deeper portions of our lungs, and from the lungs it goes into the bloodstream. Once it's there, then it triggers off an inflammatory cascade, which then circulates in the entire body, and all the possible organs in the entire body can get affected, whether that's the brain, that's the heart, kidneys, liver, all of them. That is why you see now sugars are getting uncontrolled because of this. People can develop heart attacks, people can develop arrhythmias. In fact, there's a study also that was conducted from our very popular institute, the AIMS, the Apex Institute of our country, which was quite a few years back, where they'd actually shown that there was a direct linkage between rising PM 2.5 particles in the environment to the number of patients getting hospitalized with acute heart attacks. So when it was beyond a certain level, then the rise in the number of patients getting admitted with acute heart attack was nearly increased by 20 to 25%. So that is a kind of association that it has directly. And now you also find it with the inflammatory joint diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, with the pancreas, with brain strokes, dementia. So ultimately, it's the same inflammatory cascade which is traveling all over the body and causing damage to each and every organ that comes in its way.
Okay, so after how long does it actually start showing up? Because we've been talking about why there is some amount of complacency by certain set of individuals when it comes to pollution, only because they possibly can't understand the cause and effect because it's not immediate. It's probably something which you see over a period of time, maybe many years later as well. So give us a timeline in terms of when we can expect this kind of impact post-exposure. Dr. Yeah.
I don't think there's any timeline as such that you can attribute it to. See, everybody would have an individual propensity to developing a problem. There are people who still continue to live normally, may not develop any complication at all. But then there would be others who may just develop a cold cough, which worsens into an asthma and then continues to be an asthma on a long-term basis. So you really can't attribute a certain time frame to it. But yes, looking at the situation, one can always say that with every day our and exposure to this kind of toxic gases, our life expectancy is definitely going down. I don't know if you're aware or not, but in 2015, the then president of USA, President Barack Obama, was here for the Republic Day parade, 25th, 26th, and 27th of January, only for those 3 days. And at that time, the PM 2.5 particle outside was about 78, 80, not higher than this. And imagine how many hours would he have been stayed outside. Rest of the time, he would have been in the offices or in the hotel. But however, so when the analysis was done on his return by the Cambridge University, they actually found that his life expectancy had gone down by 6 hours. That is 2 hours per day. And now, compare it, the PM 2.5 particle that we're exposed to is much higher, and the prolonged exposure that we're getting. So I won't be surprised, when the figures say that your lifespan is reduced by 11.9 years. It's like quite expected.
Oh my God. That sounds extremely grim and scary, definitely giving us a sense in terms of the kind of impact. Just wanted to get your thoughts, Dr. Pinto, in terms of, say, the elderly population and the more vulnerable population, which is already suffering from chronic problems. How much does pollution impact them? Say, for example, asthma, COPD, or maybe even diabetes, dementia. Incrementally, what is the impact on them?
So that's the unfortunate paradox, right? So we live in an age where we know that physical activity for the elderly is extremely important, that a lot of things like life expectancy or number of years you live without disease depend on how active you are. So all of us as doctors, on one hand, encourage our patients to go outdoors, to go walk, to exercise as much as they can. And then on the other hand, the same elderly have to walk with this kind of an air quality and get triggered by it. So that balance where you tell people who are elderly who need to be active, you tell them to sit at home and put on their air purifiers. I mean, how is that good for anyone? Now, those who continue to go outdoors because, that's part of their lifestyle and be exposed to these kinds of levels of toxic dust, a lot of them very often get triggered, very often will start coughing, will get breathless, land up in the hospital. And unfortunately, for a few of them, this could be their terminal event. This could be the event that finally, unfortunately, takes their lives away. So I think it's really unfortunate that as our population is growing as well, we should make a lot of efforts to try and make our population more active, more outdoorsy. But at the same time, there is a trade-off here when the air quality is so poor.
Okay. And there is a core, what is the impact, say, for example, if you do high intensity cardiovascular exercises when it is, highly polluted outside? That's supposed to be a no-no.
Because it's just your cumulative exposure, right? The greater your respiratory rate, the deeper your breath, the more exposed you are to the particulate matter. So for a given minute, if you breathe 12 times versus if you breathe 16 times, it's more likely that your dose is going to be a lot higher when you're hyperventilating. So that's going to be more problematic in some ways.
Okay. All right. Well, Dr. Vivek, you've spoken about indoor pollution as well, which is expected to be probably even worse than the outdoor air. But it is something that we live with, the curtains, the carpets, the pets. That's something that we've always lived with, even when pollution didn't exist. Outdoor pollution didn't exist. So does that worsen because of the outdoor pollution?
I guess ignorance is bliss. All these years we have been living with all these curtains, carpets, and thinking that they're not harming us. But now then we start literally researching into it and we realize that there are so many sources of air pollution within our houses, starting from the pets, all the heavy carpets, heavy furnishings, heavy curtains. They all trap a lot of dust. Then your kitchen smoke, if not properly ventilated, if the chimneys are out of order, or if your equipment is out of order. There's still houses in India, of course, not in Delhi NCR as much or in Mumbai kind of cities, but there's still places where they are lighting, the chula for their regular needs. So that, of course, is another smoke. Apart from that, People are lighting agarbattis, dhoops, camphor, havans happening inside the houses. Ultimately, they are all emitting smoke, and the smoke accumulating and your exposure is increasing multifolds.
Sure.
So we need to go away from all these. These are the main sources, and then dampness on the walls, in the basements, in the washrooms.
Okay.
So these are the most common sources of air pollution indoors.
Okay, so let's now, talk about how we can probably help ourselves when it comes to pollution. So, Dr. Pinto, I'm going to ask you, which masks do you think are possibly most effective to deal with PM 2.5? And do we need to even wear masks? If so, how often?
So the most efficient masks are what are called high efficiency masks, or the N95 group of masks, which filter out a significant proportion of very fine particles. The problem with N95 masks is you need a tight seal. You need a seal such that when you breathe in, you feel the mask collapse. It's almost like in a vacuum there. And it's not very easy to breathe through, right? Especially if you have an underlying respiratory condition, to walk or to exercise with an N95 is not the easiest thing. The second problem with masks is that you need to change them frequently, because with this kind of pollution levels that we are dealing with, the pores or the holes in the mask are going to get clogged very soon. So unless you replace them almost on a daily basis, they are actually going to increase the resistance to breathing and may not be as efficient at filtering. So my general advice is that if you have to go out on a really polluted day, wear a mask. You're protected to some extent versus nothing at all. If you have underlying respiratory diseases and find it extremely difficult to breathe through an N95, wear a simple medical mask, which at least will filter out a lot of the larger particles. It may not filter out the PM 2.5s, but the filtering out of the larger particles to some extent will also reduce your exposure and irritation and the cough that's associated with this kind of air quality.
Well, Dr. Vivek, just quickly, if you could just give us a sense, air purifiers, which one would you recommend using?
So it's very difficult to say whether to use air purifiers or not, because ultimately, while the logic says that when you're using air purifier, it cleans up the air, but has it really impacted health? Do we have a study which says that, okay, you start using air purifiers and the incidence of asthma or COPD will come down? We don't. So to say that, you recommend it on a mass scale basis is not possible. But what I can always say is that people who already have an underlying lung disease like asthma, COPD, or high interstitial lung disease, or something like a heart disease, who are already in the susceptible group, pregnant ladies, elders, children less than 5. So this is the highly susceptible group. They could use air purifiers at home. And air purifiers, they have to, be sure that it's in a sealed environment. Doors are completely locked, windows are sealed. Second is that it has to be the size of the air purifier has to be proportionate to the size of the room, so that it's able to filter accordingly. And third is that, yes, we would expect some degree of inflammation, which will go down, especially if there are air purifiers with certain kind of ionized particles, which can actually take care of the toxic gases also. That would be the best air purifier to use.
Okay, all right. And quickly, just before, we need to wrap up on the show, Dr. Pinto, supplements, steam, saline, dietary changes, what helps? People want to, possibly protect themselves from the pollution. Which of these would probably help, and how much and what?
So there's very little scientific evidence suggesting that you can kind of get some sort of immunity against pollution at these levels by supplementing your medications. But what I would suggest is, if you have an underlying respiratory condition, this is not the time to experiment with your medications. If you're on an inhaler, this is the time to be extremely regular with your medications. People have had a good run because it was raining in Mumbai till October. The air quality was good. And let that not lead to a false sense of security, and therefore you lower your guard, and then when you're exposed to this, you suddenly have an attack. So I would say just be regular with all your routine medications, and try to be as sensible and healthy as possible.
Okay, all right, Dr. Vivek as well as Dr. Pinto, thank you very much for joining in and speaking with us. And I'm sure that the government authorities are looking closely into this as well. Thank you very much for talking to us on pollution.
Thank you.